Welcome to this deep analysis of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Tell us where you're watching from. I ask that you subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing stories in this format. Well, here it is. The basement archive of the Massachusetts Historical Preservation Society smells of aged paper and chemical preservatives, a scent that has become familiar to Dr. Sarah Chen after 15 years of restoration work. On this particular November morning, cold rain hammers against the narrow windows near the ceiling, creating a rhythmic backdrop to her meticulous labor. She sits at her specialized workstation, surrounded by magnification equipment, chemical baths, and digital scanning devices that cost more than most people earn in a year. The photograph before her arrived 3 weeks ago in a deteriorating cardboard box, donated by the estate of Margaret Hannon, the last surviving descendant of a once prominent Boston mercantile family. Sarah's hands, steady despite her 43 years and the early arthritis beginning to settle into her joints, guide the delicate daguerreotype under the high-resolution scanner. The image shows 5 people arranged in the formal style typical of 1862 photography: a stern patriarch with mutton chop whiskers, his wife in dark silk with a cameo brooch, 3 children ranging from perhaps 6 to 14 years old, all frozen in that peculiar stillness required by the long exposure times of Civil War-era cameras. The Hannon family appears prosperous, their clothing speaking of wealth accumulated through shipping and textile interests. The father sits in a carved mahogany chair that Sarah recognizes from other period photographs as an expensive piece meant to signal status. His hand rests on a leather-bound Bible, another common prop meant to convey moral authority and religious devotion. The mother stands beside him, one hand on his shoulder in a gesture of wifely support, the other resting on the shoulder of the youngest child, a girl in a white dress with elaborate lace trim. The 2 older boys stand to the side, their faces already showing the stern determination that would be expected of future businessmen. But it's not the family that catches Sarah's attention as the digital enhancement software begins its work. In the background, barely visible in the original print, a figure emerges with startling clarity under modern technology. A black boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, stands in the shadows of what appears to be a doorway. His face, now visible in detail that the original photographers never intended, shows an expression that makes Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Pure, undiluted terror that transcends the century and a half between the moment the shutter opened and this cold November morning. His eyes are wide, the whites visible even in the sepia tones of the aged photograph, and his mouth is slightly open as if caught mid-gasp. His hands, she notices as she increases the magnification, are positioned strangely, as though bound or restrained just out of frame. The left hand appears to be reaching forward, fingers splayed in what could be a gesture of supplication or an aborted attempt to call for help. Sarah leans back in her chair, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back from hours of hunched concentration. She's seen thousands of historical photographs, documented countless moments from America's complicated past, but something about this image disturbs her in a way she cannot immediately articulate. The juxtaposition of the Hannon family's studied composure and the boy's obvious distress creates a narrative tension that demands investigation. The family looks directly at the camera with the confidence of people who own their place in the world, while the boy in the background seems to shrink from view, as if trying to make himself invisible even as the camera captures his presence. She saves the enhanced image to her secure server and begins the painstaking process of documenting every detail. The boy's clothing, what little is visible, appears to be rough homespun fabric, dramatically different from the fine materials worn by the family. There's something on his neck, a mark or perhaps a collar, though the resolution isn't quite sufficient to determine which. His hair is cropped close to his scalp, a stark contrast to the elaborate hairstyles of the Hannon children. One of his shoulders appears slightly higher than the other, suggesting either a physical deformity or an injury that never properly healed. Sarah cross-references the donation documents, finding only sparse information. The photograph was taken at the Hannon family estate in Cambridge, Massachusetts, by Jonathan Whitfield, a photographer whose work she's encountered before in other collections. The date is confirmed by Margaret Hannon handwritten note, July 1862, just weeks after the Battle of Malvern Hill. The note, written in the shaky cursive of extreme old age, says simply, "Family Portrait, Cambridge House, Summer of War." By the time Sarah locks the archive that evening, she's made a decision that will consume the next several months of her life. This photograph deserves more than routine processing and storage. The boy in the background deserves to have his story told. She walks home through the November rain, her umbrella doing little to keep the wind-driven droplets from soaking her jacket. The streets of Cambridge glow with the lights of restaurants and shops, students from nearby Harvard hurrying between classes with earbuds in and faces bent towards smartphones. Sarah thinks about the distance between this comfortable present and the moment captured in the photograph, about how easy it would be to catalog and store the image without asking the uncomfortable questions it raises. But she knows she won't do that. She can't. That terrified face has already lodged itself in her conscience, demanding acknowledgement, demanding witness. The Cambridge Public Library's genealogy section occupies the entire third floor of the historic building on Broadway, its tall windows offering views of bare November trees and the steady stream of Harvard students hurrying between classes. Sarah arrives on Saturday morning with her laptop, notebooks, and a determination that her colleague Marcus identifies immediately when she claims the corner research table. Marcus Washington, the library's chief genealogist, is a 60-year-old man whose family has lived in Cambridge for 5 generations and whose knowledge of local history runs deeper than any database. When Sarah shows him the enhanced photograph, his reaction is immediate and visceral. His jaw tightens, and something that looks like old anger flashes in his dark eyes before he schools his expression back to professional neutrality. He's seen images like this before, he tells Sarah, photographs where the comfortable lies of history crack open to reveal the violence beneath. He asks to see the original documentation, and Sarah watches as his fingers trace the edges of the donation forms with a gentleness that contradicts his imposing frame. Marcus explains what Sarah has already begun to suspect. Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1783, making it one of the first states to do so, but this didn't mean black people in Boston lived as equals in 1862. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, still in effect when this photograph was taken, meant that escaped slaves could be captured and returned to Southern owners even in free states. Some wealthy Northern families, particularly those with business interests in the South, harbored complicated relationships with the institution they publicly opposed. The hypocrisy was rarely discussed openly, buried beneath layers of social respectability and careful legal maneuvering. Boston liked to think of itself as the cradle of abolitionism, Marcus explains, but the city's textile mills processed Southern cotton, its banks financed plantation operations, and its merchants grew wealthy on trade that depended fundamentally on enslaved labor. The Hannon family, Marcus reveals after 2 hours of digging through property records and shipping manifests, owned textile mills that processed cotton from Southern plantations. Their wealth was built on threads that slaves had picked under the brutal Mississippi sun. Sarah and Marcus spend the following 3 weeks constructing a detailed picture of the Hannon family in 1862. Cornelius Hannon, the patriarch in the photograph, was 47 years old, a self-made millionaire who had arrived in Boston from Ireland at age 16 with nothing but ambition and a willingness to work harder than his competitors. His rise had been meteoric. From dock worker to warehouse manager to owner of his own textile operation in less than 20 years. He married well, choosing Eleanor Winthrop, daughter of a family whose lineage traced back to the Puritan founders of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Their 3 children, Cornelius Jr., Elizabeth, and William, attended the finest schools and wanted for nothing. The family employed a staff of 12 at their Cambridge estate, a sprawling property that overlooked the Charles River. The house itself was a showpiece of Victorian architecture, with multiple wings, formal gardens, and a carriage house that held 4 vehicles. Society pages from the period mention dinners and receptions hosted by the Hannons, gatherings where Boston's elite discussed politics and culture while servants moved silently through candlelit rooms. But it's the business records that begin to reveal a darker picture. Cornelius Hannon made frequent trips to South Carolina and Georgia, ostensibly to negotiate cotton contracts, but the timing of these trips corresponds with something else. the months following major Union victories when Confederate territories were in chaos and the enforcement of slave laws became inconsistent. Sarah discovers a letter in the Massachusetts Historical Society's collections, written by Cornelius to a business associate, dated May 1862. The language is carefully coded, discussing special cargo and private arrangements that circumvent normal shipping channels. Marcus, reading over her shoulder, points out the significance. This is the language slave traders used when discussing human trafficking. They find more letters, piecing together a pattern of business dealings that existed in the murky space between legal commerce and criminal enterprise. Another letter, this one from a Georgia planter named Hiram Crawford, discusses the delivery of merchandise to Boston via a circuitous route through Philadelphia. The price mentioned, $500, is far too high for any ordinary commodity but consistent with the going rate for enslaved teenagers in the early war years. The photographer, Jonathan Whitfield, proves easier to research. He was a prominent Boston portrait artist who documented many wealthy families during the Civil War era. His studio records, preserved in the Boston Athenaeum, show an appointment with the Hannon family for July 15, 1862, with a note indicating the session was conducted at the family's request at their private residence rather than at Whitfield's studio. This was unusual but not unprecedented for families of significant wealth. What troubles Sarah more are the details she finds about what was happening in Cambridge during the summer of 1862. Newspaper archives reveal a series of incidents, reports of disturbances in wealthy households, a suspicious fire at a property neighboring the Hannon estate, and a brief mention in the Cambridge Chronicle of a vagrant youth who was reported to authorities but never located. The dates cluster around mid-July, the same time the photograph was taken. Sarah begins to feel she's pursuing a ghost through fragmentary records and coded language, chasing a boy whose name she doesn't know, whose fate remains unclear, but whose terrified face haunts her dreams. She shows the enhanced photograph to Dr. Robert Thornton, a historian at Boston University who specializes in the Underground Railroad and fugitive slave networks in Massachusetts. Robert is a meticulous researcher with thick glasses and a habit of speaking slowly, choosing each word with academic precision. His response to the photograph is immediate. This is not the face of a servant or hired help, and certainly not a family member. This is someone who fears for their life. Robert introduces Sarah to the concept of shadow slavery that existed in the North during the Civil War period. While slavery was illegal, some wealthy families with Southern connections held black individuals in conditions that amounted to involuntary servitude, using threats, coercion, and the fear of being turned over to slave catchers under the Fugitive Slave Act. These arrangements were kept hidden, documented in private letters and coded business transactions, invisible to neighbors and local authorities who might disapprove. The practice was rare but real, a dirty secret whispered about in abolitionist circles but difficult to prove. Robert pulls out maps of Cambridge from the 1860s, showing Sarah the Hannon estate's location relative to known safe houses on the Underground Railroad. The proximity is striking. Less than 2 miles separated the Hannon property from a Quaker meeting house that abolitionists used as a way station for escaped slaves heading north to Canada. It would have been possible, Robert explains, for someone in the abolitionist network to receive word about the boy and organize a rescue operation relatively quickly once they knew he was there. Sarah returns to the photograph again and again, studying every pixel of the boy's face, looking for clues in his clothing, his posture, the shadows surrounding him. She notices something she missed before. The doorway he stands in appears to lead downward, suggesting a basement or cellar entrance. The angle of the light hitting his face is wrong for natural daylight, indicating he's positioned below the level of the main floor where the family sits. He's literally beneath them, hidden in the darkness while they display their prosperity for the camera. The more Sarah learns about the Hannon family's business operations, the clearer the picture becomes. Cornelius Hannon was engaged in a form of human trafficking that exploited the chaos of wartime to acquire enslaved people in Confederate territory and transport them north, where they could be held temporarily and then sold back into slavery once prices stabilized. It was a calculated business strategy that treated human beings as commodities to be bought and sold for profit. The boy in the photograph was one of these commodities, though how he came to be in the Cambridge house and what the Hannons planned to do with him remains unclear from the documentary evidence alone. Winter settles over Cambridge with a vengeance, bringing ice storms that coat the trees in crystal and make the walk from Sarah's apartment to the library treacherous. She persists, driven by an obsession that her partner Emily gently questions over breakfast one Saturday morning. Emily, a defense attorney with sharp instincts about Sarah's emotional states, points out that Sarah has always been drawn to the forgotten, the overlooked, the people history tried to erase. This photograph has become personal in a way that transcends professional interest. Sarah knows Emily is right, but she cannot stop. The boy in the photograph has become real to her, not just a historical curiosity but a human being who suffered, who was afraid, who deserves to be remembered. She expands her research, reaching out to archives across New England, requesting any documents related to the Hannon family or their business interests. The responses trickle in slowly, shipping manifests from the Port of Boston, tax records from Cambridge, church registries from the Episcopal congregation the Hannons attended. Each document adds another layer to the picture, but the boy remains absent from official records, a ghost existing only in the accidental documentation of a photograph meant to showcase something entirely different. Then Marcus calls with a breakthrough. He's found a diary kept by a woman named Prudence Alcott, a teacher at a school for free black children in Boston during the 1860s. The diary, held in private hands until recently donated to the Boston Athenaeum, contains an entry from August 1862 that makes Sarah's hands shake as she reads the transcribed text. Prudence writes of hearing from a trusted friend about a boy, age 13, who appeared at a safe house on the Underground Railroad route through Concord in late July. The boy was in a state of complete terror, barely verbal, with marks on his wrists and ankles consistent with restraints. He claimed to have escaped from a house in Cambridge where he was being held by a family involved in Southern trade. The boy, Prudence writes, had been purchased in South Carolina during a business trip and brought north under false papers claiming he was a personal servant, a maneuver that technically violated Massachusetts law but was difficult to prosecute without the boy's cooperation, which his captors ensured through threats and violence. The boy told his rescuers that the family planned to sell him back to a plantation owner in Georgia once certain business arrangements were finalized, a transaction that would have netted them significant profit. He spoke of being kept in a locked cellar room, fed minimally, and threatened with torture if he made any noise that might alert neighbors or visitors to his presence. Sarah reads and rereads this entry, feeling the weight of historical horror settle into her bones. The diary doesn't provide the boy's name, and Prudence's records end abruptly in 1863 when she herself died of scarlet fever. But the timeline matches perfectly. Late July, Cambridge, a family involved in Southern trade. Sarah shows the diary entry to Robert Thornton, who confirms her interpretation. This was almost certainly the boy in the photograph. The question becomes what happened during that photography session. Did the boy see the photographer's arrival as a chance for escape? Was his terrified expression a silent plea for help that Jonathan Whitfield either didn't see or chose to ignore? Sarah decides to investigate Whitfield himself more thoroughly. She discovers he was a Quaker, a member of a religious community known for their abolitionist sympathies. His studio in Boston was located in a neighborhood with strong anti-slavery sentiment. Would such a man have ignored evidence of captivity? She finds her answer in an unexpected place: the records of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Jonathan Whitfield's name appears on a list of contributors and supporters, though he was never a prominent activist. But in September 1862, he gave testimony to the Society's legal committee about witnessing disturbing conditions during a portrait session at a Cambridge residence. The record is frustratingly vague, mentioning only that his concerns were noted and that the committee planned to investigate, but no follow-up documentation exists. Sarah pieces together a narrative. Whitfield arrived at the Hannon estate on July 15 to photograph the family. During the session, he saw or heard something that disturbed him, possibly catching a glimpse of the boy in conditions that raised suspicions. The photograph he took captured the boy's presence accidentally, the long exposure time and the positioning of his equipment recording what the Hannons might not have realized was visible. After leaving, Whitfield reported his concerns to the Anti-Slavery Society, setting in motion events that led to the boy's escape 2 weeks later. But this is where the trail goes cold. Sarah cannot find any record of what happened to the boy after he reached the safe house in Concord. Underground Railroad records were intentionally incomplete, protecting both the escaped slaves and those who helped them. The boy could have been sent to Canada, where he would have been beyond the reach of slave catchers. He could have been placed with a free black family in a distant city. He could have been recaptured and returned to bondage. The uncertainty gnaws at Sarah through the long winter months. She submits a proposal to present her findings at the American Historical Association's annual conference, framing the photograph as a case study in the hidden realities of Northern complicity in slavery. The proposal is accepted, and she begins preparing her presentation, but she feels the incompleteness of the story like a missing tooth her tongue keeps probing. In late February, Sarah receives an email from a genealogist in Toronto who has been following her research through academic circles. The genealogist, whose name is Patricia Morrison, specializes in tracing the descendants of people who escaped slavery via the Underground Railroad to Canada. Patricia has been researching a family named Freeman who settled in Ontario in 1863. The patriarch of the Freeman family was a man named Thomas Freeman, but family oral history suggested this was not his birth name, that he had taken it after escaping bondage in the American South. Thomas Freeman had a son, born around 1849, who would have been 13 in 1862. Patricia has been unable to trace this son's origins definitively, but family stories speak of a harrowing escape from a northern city, unusual because most Underground Railroad narratives involve escape from southern plantations. The family oral history describes the escape as particularly dangerous because it involved rescuing the boy from a wealthy household where he was being held against his will, a scenario that required careful planning and the cooperation of multiple abolitionists. Sarah's heart races as she reads the email. Patricia attaches photographs of the Freeman family taken in Canada in the 1870s and 80s. The son, now a grown man, appears in several images. Sarah enlarges the photographs on her computer screen, comparing facial features, the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw. Photographic comparison across decades is imprecise, especially given the changes that occur between adolescence and adulthood, but there are similarities that cannot be dismissed. The grown man in the Canadian photographs has the same distinctive bone structure visible in the terrified boy from the Hannon family portrait. The same slight asymmetry in his shoulders is apparent, suggesting that whatever injury or deformity caused it persisted into adulthood. Sarah contacts Patricia immediately, and they spend hours on the phone comparing notes and sharing documentation. Patricia explains that the Freeman family has maintained detailed oral histories, passed down through generations, about their ancestors' escape from slavery. While many details have been lost or transformed over time, certain core elements remain consistent. The boy was held in a northern city, escaped with the help of abolitionists, and made his way to Canada where he took a new name symbolizing his freedom. The family has preserved a few artifacts from that time, including a crudely drawn map showing the route from Massachusetts to Ontario, and a piece of fabric the boy tore from his clothing as a reminder of where he came from. Spring comes to Massachusetts with an explosion of cherry blossoms along the Charles River, and Sarah stands at the podium of the conference center in Philadelphia, presenting her research to 300 historians gathered for the American Historical Association's annual meeting. The Hannon family photograph, now enhanced and annotated, fills the screen behind her. She walks her audience through the investigation, the documentary evidence, the connection to Prudence Alcott's diary and Jonathan Whitfield's testimony to the Anti-Slavery Society. She presents the possible Canadian connection, careful to note that absolute proof remains elusive, but the circumstantial evidence forms a compelling narrative. When she finishes, the room erupts with questions. Some historians challenge her interpretation, arguing that she's reading too much into fragmentary evidence. Others praise the work as exactly the kind of scholarship needed to illuminate the forgotten corners of American history. A woman in the third row, African American, perhaps in her 60s, raises her hand and asks the question Sarah has been dreading. What gives her, a Chinese American woman with no personal connection to slavery's legacy, the right to tell this story? Sarah takes a breath before answering honestly. She explains that she cannot claim to fully understand the weight of this history, that her ancestors faced their own oppression when they came to America in the late 19th century, but that this is not equivalent to the generational trauma of slavery. She researched this story not to claim ownership of it, but because the boy's face in that photograph demanded witness, demanded that someone see his terror and refused to let it be forgotten. She sees this work as a responsibility that comes with her training and position, a responsibility to use her skills to recover voices that history tried to silence, while remaining aware that recovery is not the same as fully understanding or experiencing that history. The woman in the third row nods slowly, and Sarah sees something like approval in her expression, though she knows she'll continue to wrestle with these questions of whose stories can be told by whom and how. After the presentation, several people approach with new information. A historian from South Carolina has records of a plantation owner named Hiram Crawford who dealt with the Hannon textile business and who reported the loss of a teenage slave in early 1862, around the time Cornelius Hannon visited Georgia. A genealogist from Boston has found a brief notation in Cambridge police records from July 1862 about a complaint filed by Cornelius Hannon regarding a runaway servant, though no follow-up action was recorded. Each piece confirms Sarah's reconstruction of events. The boy was held illegally in the Hannon household, likely intended for resale to Southern buyers. His escape, possibly facilitated by Jonathan Whitfield's alert to anti-slavery activists, saved him from being returned to plantation slavery. The story gains national attention when Sarah publishes her findings in the Journal of American History. Journalists contact her for interviews, and the photograph appears in newspapers and websites across the country. The Massachusetts Historical Preservation Society receives dozens of inquiries about the image, and Sarah finds herself thrust into a public conversation about hidden histories and the need to interrogate seemingly innocent historical artifacts for the violence they contain. Patricia Morrison contacts Sarah with news from Canada. The Freeman family descendants have been following the coverage, and they want to speak with Sarah. A video call is arranged for a Saturday morning in May, and Sarah finds herself on screen with three people: Patricia, a woman in her 70s named Grace Freeman Johnson, and Grace's daughter Carol. Grace is the great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Freeman, and she's grown up hearing family stories that now seem to connect with Sarah's research. Grace speaks with quiet dignity about the stories passed down in her family. Her great-great-grandfather, the boy who escaped in 1862, was originally from Virginia, sold at age 11 to a South Carolina planter after his mother died trying to protect him from being separated from his siblings. The planter's fortunes declined during the early war years, and he sold several slaves to settle debts, including the boy who would become Thomas Freeman. The boy was purchased by a northern businessman who claimed to need a personal servant, but the reality was far darker. The northerner's real intention was to hold the boy temporarily and then resell him at profit once Confederate currency stabilized. Grace's voice wavers slightly as she describes what family oral history recorded about those weeks in Cambridge. The boy was kept in a locked cellar room, allowed out only for brief periods under strict supervision. He was told that if he tried to speak to anyone, he would be sold to the cruelest plantation in Mississippi where he would work until he died in the cotton fields. The day the photographer came, the boy was brought upstairs briefly because the household staff was occupied with preparations, and someone, possibly a cook who took pity on him, told him to stay quiet in the back hallway. When he heard voices in the front parlor and realized an outsider was present, he moved toward the light, hoping somehow to signal his distress. He didn't know if the photographer saw him or understood his situation, but 2 weeks later, people came in the night, abolitionists who had been alerted to his presence, and they got him out through a window while the family slept. Sarah listens with tears streaming down her face, understanding that she's hearing the lived reality behind the documentary fragments she's spent months assembling. Grace continues, explaining that the boy was taken first to Concord, then to safe houses in Vermont, and finally across the border to Canada where he took the surname Freeman to mark his new status. He married, raised 6 children, worked as a carpenter, and lived until 1912, dying at the age of 63 surrounded by descendants who knew him as a quiet man who rarely spoke of his years in bondage but who valued freedom with an intensity that shaped his entire family's values. Carol, Grace's daughter, adds that the family kept certain items that Thomas Freeman brought with him from his escape. A small piece of fabric torn from his shirt, which he said he kept as a reminder of where he came from, and a crudely drawn map showing the route from Cambridge to Canada, made by the people who rescued him. They've donated these items to the Buxton National Historic Site and Museum in Ontario, which preserves Underground Railroad history. Sarah asks the question she's been most afraid to voice. Does the family want the photograph? Grace considers this carefully before answering. She says the photograph is painful to look at, seeing her great-great-grandfather in that moment of terror, but she believes it belongs in the public record. It's evidence of what happened, not just to one boy but to many whose suffering was hidden behind the facades of northern respectability. She asks only that if the photograph is displayed, it should be presented with his story, with his name, Thomas Freeman, and with the context of how he survived and built a life of dignity despite everything he endured. The Massachusetts Historical Preservation Society organizes an exhibition for October, timed to coincide with the anniversary of the photograph's discovery. Sarah curates the display personally, ensuring that Thomas Freeman's story is told completely, from his birth in Virginia through his captivity in Cambridge to his long life in Canada. The Hannon family photograph is displayed alongside the Canadian images of Thomas as an adult, showing visitors the man he became, not just the terrified child he was. Descendants of the Hannon family issue a public statement acknowledging their ancestors' participation in the exploitation of enslaved people and announcing a substantial donation to organizations working to address the ongoing impacts of slavery and racism. The statement is careful and lawyered, but Sarah recognizes it as more than many families offer when confronted with ugly histories. On the night before the exhibition opens, Sarah stands alone in the gallery, looking at the photograph that has consumed her life for the past year. Thomas Freeman's face, frozen in that moment of fear, looks back at her across the gulf of time. She thinks about the photographer, Jonathan Whitfield, who captured this image and then acted on what he witnessed, setting in motion the rescue that saved a life. She thinks about the abolitionists who risked prosecution under the Fugitive Slave Act to spirit Thomas to safety. She thinks about Prudence Alcott, whose careful documentation preserved a crucial piece of the story. She thinks about Thomas himself, who survived and persisted and created a family that thrives generations later. The photograph is no longer just an artifact of historical interest to Sarah. It's a testament to resistance, to the power of bearing witness, to the capacity of human beings to see suffering and respond with compassion despite the risks. It's also a reminder of how much hidden history remains buried in archives, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what was always there, concealed in the shadows, demanding to be acknowledged. Marcus joins her in the gallery, bringing coffee in paper cups from the shop across the street. They stand together in comfortable silence, two people from different backgrounds united in the work of excavating difficult truths. Marcus tells her about a new collection that's come in, papers from an abolitionist family in Worcester, and Sarah feels the familiar pull of curiosity, the need to dig deeper into the past. But tonight, she simply stands with the photograph, paying quiet respect to Thomas Freeman, who was seen, who was saved, who lived. The exhibition opens to overflow crowds, and Sarah watches people move through the gallery, pausing before the Hannon family photograph, reading the detailed panels that explain what they're seeing. She watches faces change as visitors understand the narrative, as they see beyond the formal Victorian portrait to the human drama playing out in its margins. Several times she sees people cry, and she understands that these tears are not just for Thomas Freeman but for all those whose suffering went unwitnessed, whose names were lost, whose photographs were never taken or preserved. A high school teacher from Roxbury brings her students, using the exhibition as a starting point for discussions about local history and the ways racism shaped the development of Boston and surrounding communities. Sarah overhears one student, a young black girl perhaps 15 years old, say to her friend that she never knew slavery had reached into Massachusetts, that she thought the North was always the good side in the Civil War narrative. The exhibition forces a reckoning with more complicated truths. In December, Sarah receives a package from Canada. Inside is a letter from Grace Freeman Johnson and a small framed photograph of Thomas Freeman as an elderly man, sitting on the porch of his Ontario home, surrounded by grandchildren. His face in this image is peaceful, marked by age and experience but no longer bearing any trace of the terror visible in the Hannon family portrait. Grace's letter explains that the family wanted Sarah to have this image as thanks for her work in uncovering Thomas's story. The letter concludes with words that Sarah tapes to her office wall. "You saw him when others looked away. You gave voice to his silence. Thank you for making sure he is remembered not just as a victim but as a survivor, a man who built a life of meaning despite everything that tried to destroy him." Sarah places the photograph of elderly Thomas on her desk, where she can see it while she works. It serves as a reminder of why she does this work, sorting through the fragments of the past, looking for the overlooked and forgotten, refusing to let difficult histories remain buried. The Hannon family photograph, with its accidental documentation of a boy's terror, has become one of the most frequently requested images in the Massachusetts Historical Preservation Society's collection, used in textbooks and documentaries about slavery in the North, about the Underground Railroad, about the complicated relationship between Northern prosperity and Southern bondage. But for Sarah, it will always be primarily about Thomas Freeman, about the moment he was seen and the chain of events that followed, about the difference one act of witness can make. As spring returns to Cambridge, bringing warmth and renewal, Sarah begins a new project, investigating records from Connecticut textile mills with documented ties to Southern cotton. She knows there will be more photographs, more hidden stories, more voices calling out from the margins of history. She's learned that the past is never really past, that its violence echoes forward into the present, that only by confronting these difficult truths can any kind of reconciliation or healing begin. The work is never finished, but it's work worth doing, and Sarah carries forward the lesson Thomas Freeman's photograph taught her, that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we almost miss, visible only to those willing to look closely enough to see what everyone else overlooked, preserved by accident, recovered through persistence, and shared as testimony to the resilience of human dignity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Emily joins Sarah for dinner one evening in late spring, and they talk about the impact the project has had on Sarah's life and work. Emily notes that Sarah seems different somehow, more settled in her purpose, less apologetic about the intensity of her commitment to this work. Sarah agrees, explaining that the photograph taught her something important about the nature of historical investigation. It's not just about documenting facts and dates, though that matters. It's about recognizing the humanity in every fragment of the past, about refusing to let suffering be forgotten or minimized, about creating space for voices that were silenced to finally be heard. The Hannon family photograph hangs now in a permanent exhibition at the Massachusetts Historical Preservation Society, accompanied by extensive contextual materials that explain what visitors are seeing and why it matters. Thomas Freeman's face, caught in that moment of terror, looks out at thousands of visitors each year, and while his fear is still visible, it's no longer the only thing people see. They see also his survival, his resistance, his refusal to be erased. They see the network of people who worked to save him, the photographer who bore witness, the abolitionist who risked everything, the teacher who documented his story. They see a system of oppression that reached far beyond the plantations of the South, infiltrating even the supposedly free states of the North, and they see also the ongoing work of confronting that history and its lasting impacts. Sarah continues her work in the archives, finding new stories, uncovering new evidence of both historical violence and historical resistance. Each photograph she processes, each document she catalogs, carries the potential for revelation, for the recovery of lost narratives that challenge simplified versions of the past. She's become something of an expert on the hidden realities of slavery in the North, speaking at conferences and publishing articles that force historians to grapple with uncomfortable truths about regional complicity in a system that most northern states claimed to oppose. The impact of her work extends beyond academic circles. Descendants of enslaved people contact her with family stories and artifacts, hoping she can help them piece together genealogies that slavery deliberately destroyed. Educators use her research to develop curriculum that presents a more complete picture of American history. The Hannon family photograph becomes a touchstone in national conversations about how we remember difficult histories. Sarah receives invitations to speak at universities across the country, traveling to campuses where the legacy of slavery remains visible. At each venue, she presents the photograph and tells Thomas Freeman's story, watching audiences grapple with the implications. People want to know how common such practices were, whether other Northern families engaged in similar trafficking, what happened to the Hannon family after Thomas escaped. Sarah answers honestly, acknowledging the limits of what the historical record can tell us while emphasizing what is clear. Northern prosperity was built in part on Southern slavery, and the moral superiority that Northern states claimed was often more complicated than later generations wanted to believe. In the autumn following the exhibition's opening, Sarah is contacted by a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a film about the photograph. The filmmaker envisions a project combining Sarah's research with the Freeman family's oral histories. Sarah agrees to participate, insisting that Grace Freeman Johnson and her family must be central to the project. The filming takes 6 months, with crews traveling to Massachusetts, Ontario, South Carolina, and Georgia. The documentary premieres at film festivals and generates significant media attention, bringing Thomas Freeman's story to millions. The film ends with footage of the exhibition and Grace's voice reading from her letter. "Thank you for making sure he is remembered not just as a victim but as a survivor, a man who built a life of meaning despite everything that tried to destroy him." Years pass, and Sarah continues her work in the archives, finding new stories, training new researchers, contributing to a transformation in how Americans understand their history. The Hannon family photograph remains her most well-known discovery, but it's far from her only contribution. She uncovers evidence of other instances of shadow slavery in northern states, documents the networks of resistance that worked to free illegally held individuals, traces connections between northern business interests and southern plantations. Each discovery adds another piece to a complex historical puzzle. The photograph that started it all hangs in her office now, a small print of the enhanced image showing Thomas Freeman's terrified face looking out from the shadows behind the prosperous Hannon family. Sarah glances at it often while she works, a reminder of what can be found when someone looks closely enough, when someone refuses to accept the surface narrative of a historical artifact. She thinks about all the other photographs in all the other archives, wondering what stories they might contain if someone took the time to truly see them, to ask difficult questions, to follow the threads of evidence wherever they might lead. The work of historical recovery is never finished, Sarah has learned, because there are always more stories waiting to be told, more voices calling out from the margins of preserved documents, more faces in the background of formal portraits whose expressions tell truths the photographers never intended to capture. Thomas Freeman's story has been recovered and shared, but countless others remain lost, their names unknown, their fates undocumented, their suffering unacknowledged. Sarah carries this knowledge with her as she continues her work, understanding that each story she uncovers is both an ending and a beginning, a recovery of what was lost and a reminder of how much more remains hidden, waiting for someone to see. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.